Hello, everybody. It is December 26, 2025. I hope everyone out there had a fantastic Christmas. Mine was great. I hope everyone out there that celebrates this holiday, which I'm hoping most of you do, got to spend time with your family and really enjoyed your Christmas. We're actually leaving our Christmas trees up until January 7th. I am an Orthodox Christian, but I'm in the OCA, the Orthodox Church of America, or in America, rather, and we celebrate Christmas on the new calendar, the 25th, along with several other jurisdictions, while the Serbians, the Russians, the canonical Ukrainian Church, and I believe the Belarusians and several others actually celebrate Christmas on January 7th. So my family decided, well, we'll just leave our tree up until both Christmases are over. Now, my personal opinion is perhaps the church should have stayed on the old calendar. I'm not going to get into that, but I do celebrate with my family on the 25th because, well, that's when everyone else does it. It makes everything more convenient with the family and whatnot because I'm the only Orthodox person in my family. So it's just easier if we line our Christmases up with theirs. But, also we do keep the celebration alive through January 7th. So Merry Christmas to everyone that had their Christmas on the 25th. And I will be saying Merry Christmas to everyone whose Christmas is on the 7th. So that goes to all you people in ROKOR, Ukraine, Russia, Serbia, Belarus. I'm sure you guys are all looking forward to your Christmases as well. So we get a few topics for tonight. I'm only going to be on here for about a half an hour or so. I'll give everyone a few minutes to come in. If anyone is out there tonight, I'm sure most people are probably still busy with their families, which is great. I hope y'all are. But I want to talk about the inevitability of this schism within the Republican Party over things that are too contradictory to be part of the same platform. These things were always going to cause a rift within the party. It was just a matter of time before the momentum built up enough to make people really look at the Republican platform and see the contradictions within it. And regardless of how anyone feels about it, well, that's the reality of it. I would say the America First position, the true America First position, and the conic / Israel First position are just irreconcilable and can't exist within the same party. I think anyone from the outside looking in would see this and say, well, yeah, no kidding, no amount of gaslighting or being a hall monitor or accusing people of being nefarious is actually going to just make this go away and fix the problem. Like if you're in a political party and that political party's platform is, your particular country first and foremost above all others, which is the reasonable position for any political party to hold within their own country, then it doesn't really work when a fairly large chunk of that party is dedicated to a foreign power, either for religious reasons or strategic reasons. Now, I think many Republicans actually side with the religious reason because they are, what's the word for it? Dispensationalists. Yeah, dispensationalists. So they have a religious reason for siding with Israel. And then others actually are of the opinion, well, we want to stop the spread of radical Islamism, then Israel is our first line of defense against that, which I find kind of funny because most prominent jihadist groups have actually received quite a bit of funding from the CIA and Mossad for their own ends and to achieve objectives that align with the foreign policy that they're promoting. So I do find it sort of ironic to think that it just doesn't make sense to me. But either way, these two positions are just too contradictory to coexist under the same tent. And I don't really think any amount of, again, gaslighting or lecturing people or guilting people into supporting any particular cause is actually effective in any way, shape, or form. It isn't going to reverse this trend. I wish somebody would explain that to the Mark Levins and Ben Shapiros out there who are actually making everything worse and aren't solving their problem. I think they're going to find pretty quickly that opinion is actually turning against them, not even necessarily out of like deep ideological reasons, but I think Americans just don't like being told what to do by the party that's supposed to not be telling them what to do. And then I'd like to talk about a little bit foreign intervention as it relates to the schism within the Republican Party and a few more things. So it doesn't really seem like anyone's around tonight, but we'll just get started anyways. And if anyone's out there, feel free to jump in, say hello. If you have any inputs, any feedback, anything you'd like to talk about, just leave me a chat. I'll see it, and I'll respond to it. So first and foremost, this issue within Turning Point USA and the Republican Party as a whole over whether or not ardent support for Israel is something that can't coexist with being legitimately America first. And I'm not going to get into this debate. I'm not on here championing one side or the other. I think most people could probably assume which camp I fall into. But what I want to talk about, though, is the inevitability of this and how this momentum can't be stopped. I think support for Israel within the Republican Party has always kind of been a given, especially before I think people really understood what happened with Iraq, what happened with once public opinion soured on interventions within the Middle East. And I think people started to realize why those interventions were actually taking place. I think that's really when things started to turn. People can blame Tucker Carlson and Qatar all they want, but this was always simmering beneath the surface. Like, these were pretty popular opinions amongst a lot of people within the right for quite some time. This isn't really anything new. It's just getting a bit more recognition now and becoming more prominent because I'd say more mainstream people are starting to wake up to the fact that, much of our foreign intervention has to do specifically with Israel's grand designs within the Middle East. This is just true. The strategic position that Israel finds itself in, if it wants to exist as it's existing now, it's surrounded on all sides by potentially hostile countries. Now, people can say, well, that's their own fault for the way they established themselves. I'm not going to get into that, but that is the reality that they find themselves in now. So to guarantee their own survival, they need to eliminate one by one systematically any country that could lead any kind of future conflict against them. Saddam Hussein was no fan of Israel. Bashir al-Assad was no fan of Israel. Gaddafi was no fan of Israel, even though he was in North Africa. Obviously, Iran is no fan of Israel. So what has happened over the last 20 or 30 years to eliminate those future threats one by one? Well, the United States was brought in because, again, the Israeli military can't do these things by themselves. It's not large enough. They don't have any defense in depth, really, and they can't risk opening up a wider war with a very limited power pool. So the easiest thing for them to do is to get the United States to do the dirty work for them. I mean, if you're an Israeli nationalist, I guess it would make sense to do this. But the problem is, whenever you really start to get your claws into that country that you're trying to push to do your dirty work for you, the people there start to ask, well, what's the point of this? Iraq was not a resounding success. It left a lot of bitterness in the American psyche, a lot of bitterness, actually. And there's very few people that think Iraq was a worthwhile endeavor, actually. Even many staunch Republicans realize that it was a massive mistake. It's very hard to find anybody who's gung-ho about what happened in Iraq, veteran or politician or average American alike. It's just not, thousands of American dead, tens of thousands of wounded for what? At the end of the day, what did we gain from that? Was the world made a safer place? No. Iraq was rife with terrorism and violence and death for quite some time after the invasion. That more or less just recently ended. Now Iran is generally the country pulling the strings there. Or I'd say Iraq has fallen under Iran's sphere of influence. So I don't really think this was a successful endeavor. Americans don't think it was worthwhile to do. So there's a lot of animosity towards the people that are responsible for, well, getting America into that war. And many people point to Israel because Benjamin Netanyahu is one of the people advocating for this intervention. Now, people can say what they want, but those are the facts. So Americans look at that and say, we were talked into this. This war never should have happened. The Bush family name, as far as like being a political dynasty, is ruined because of the Iraq war. And I think many Americans on the right, because they're chiefly the ones serving in the infantry, look at this and say, no more. We're done. We're finished. What vested interest do we have in this region of the world? And that one vested interest is the state of Israel, because they need the United States as their attack dog, as an insurance policy to make sure that the nations surrounding them don't act outwardly aggressively towards them. Because if you look at all the sizes of the different Arab countries, they outnumber them pretty decisively. And as the technology gap starts to close between what the United States can provide and what, say, Iran already has hypersonic missile technology that the United States doesn't have. As that technological gap starts to close between what Russia and China can provide and what the United States can provide, well, the playing field becomes a bit more even, and Israel no longer has that unassailable advantage that they once enjoyed. The IDF is not as efficient of a military as many people assumed that it was, and I think there's a lot of confidence lost in the ability of the IDF to actually fight a direct war against any of Israel's Arab neighbors. So that being said, within the Republican establishment, as this opinion becomes more widely held, people start to really question, okay, so why does AIPAC exist? Why is there such a strong lobby for this country within the American political establishment? You know, if having an ally for strategic reasons is one thing, like Japan is a strategic ally, the United Kingdom is a strategic ally, but the difference is Americans are not being blackmailed and shamed and coerced into supporting those countries. So support for Japan and the United Kingdom and our other allies across the world doesn't really cause that animosity because it's not being forced upon anybody. Because those countries actually, binding ties is another thing. Last independent thinker, binding ties to what exactly? Hey, how's it going, by the way? Glad you can make it. But anyways, people feel free to support those countries. They're not expected to. But within the Republican establishment, though, it is taboo to say, well, this one particular country I don't really support having a strategic relationship with to the extent that we do, because we feel like it's detrimental. And because there's such a pushback against any kind of dissent. Here's the thing about the American psyche that people need to understand. Americans don't like being told what to do, especially Americans that are conservatives. We by nature are very rebellious people. They like to forge our own path. We like to think of ourselves as like, you know, ruggedly independent, which to some degree we are. But you know, when you corner an American of any stripe and you tell them what to do and what to think and what countries to support, you'd better have a very good reason for it, because just the fact that you're pushing them into a corner about it will make them say no just for that reason. Even if there is some kind of sound strategic reason for it, just because you're not letting them make that choice for themselves, they will back off of it and say, no, I want nothing to do with this. And you know, within the Republican Party, it's a big part of the psyche of many people within the party. You know, I mean, it sounds kind of cliche, but like there's still like a libertarian mindset with a lot of issues, even though the libertarian position, party as a whole, is not really popular anymore. As I mentioned before, Americans don't like being told who to support and what to do. They like to make that choice freely. And when it comes to this particular state in the Middle East, they don't feel like they're allowed to make that choice. So because of that growing animosity towards the gaslighting and the lecturing, Americans are pulling back from open strategic support for Israel. And see, that's the thing that I think Mark Levin and Ben Shapiro miss, is the reason this is actually happening, the causes for this. They write it off as people being, what's the word for it, bigoted or what have you. Well, much of it actually doesn't have to do with that at all. It's just saying, well, why? What's the point? Why do I have to support this country? Why are you telling me that I have to? Why is our Middle East policy constantly revolving around what this particular country needs when psychologically Americans don't like foreign intervention? That's another thing I'm going to mention real quick too. A nation's geographical, whatever, like strategic situation, as far as like the geography that it occupies, that actually does play a big part of a country's national psyche. The United States is a fortress. Okay, we have one weak neighbor to the north, one weak neighbor to the south, and oceans on both our flanks, and two very large oceans that no one has the logistics to cross en masse. The United States is very geographically safe. We are a fortress, so there's no real deep need within the American psyche to secure our borders, to lash out in aggressive military action to defend ourselves, because we know deep down we're relatively safe. Sure, an ICBM might reach the United States, but as far as like a land invasion, it's just not something that's generally possible. We know this deep down, which is why when there is any kind of deep foreign intervention, there has to be a lot of propaganda to push Americans into accepting it. There was a lot of propaganda about the Iraq War to finally get Americans to sign up for it, a lot. There has been a lot of propaganda about the war in Ukraine to try to get Americans to support some kind of intervention. Leading up to World War I and II, politicians found it very difficult to get the American public to actually support intervening in Europe. And it took, people could say it's a false flag. Well, it took, the Lusitania being sunk to get Americans interested in fighting in World War I. It took Pearl Harbor to get Americans to sign up for World War II. Even with Vietnam, it took the Gulf of Tonkin to get Americans to support some kind of intervention. So it's not something we're naturally inclined to. Now, when you look at the Europeans, it's a bit different, though. Say you're a Latvian, or you're an Estonian, or you're a Pole, and you have a deep history with Russia and conflicts with Russia, and you have this giant, massive, powerful neighbor directly on your border with far more men and resources and equipment than you could ever hope to have. There's going to be a bit of animosity there, especially when there's been hundreds of years of conflicts. I'm not blaming the Russians in particular for anything, but this is part of the European psyche. And the Russians feel the same way. The Russians have been invaded by two Western armies, Napoleon and the Grand Armée, and they were drawn into World War I, which ended in the Bolshevik Revolution for them, which was funded by the Germans, which ended horrifically for the Russian people. And then you had World War II. So in the course of 100 years or so between, it was more than 100 years, but between Napoleon's invasion and the invasion of Nazi Germany, Russia was ravaged by an army advancing from the West. So there's a big part of the Russian psyche that's very leery about another Western army actually attacking Russia, which I think this is why there was so much animosity. Well, not animosity, but caution and protest over the expansion of NATO, again, because this is something ingrained into the Russian psyche. Within living memory, for some people, they lost 26 million of their citizens in one of the most brutal wars in human history. And then say when you look at like history between the French and the Germans and the Italians, there's a lot of wars and conflicts fought between these different countries. So I think Europeans have a bit different of a psyche when it comes to war than the United States. I think it's a lot easier to talk Europeans into fighting a war, or it's a bit different. It's a bit easier, I'd say, to convince like the average Russian that they need to sign up to fight against NATO, or the average Pole, or the average Ukrainian, or Lithuanian, or whatever, Romanian, into signing up to fight some kind of war, again, because within living memory they have fought horrific conflicts on their soil. Americans have not. So when part of a party's platform within the United States includes foreign intervention, especially after several disastrous or less than optimal, or foreign interventions with less than optimal outcomes, Americans who are already leery of this, well, wait a minute, hold on. We're not going to war with Iran. We don't want to. That's not Qatar's influence talking. That's not Qatar convincing Americans that They don't want to intervene on the behalf of Israel. That is part of the American psyche manifesting itself within our political system. We are not a people that really want to be talked into intervening in foreign affairs outside of our sphere of influence. We have no real reason to do so, and I think deep down we know that and understand it. And I think say Europe immolates again for the third time in 100 years. Like, there's another disastrous European conflict. Americans will not sign up for this one. I guarantee you that. If war really kicked off between the EU and Russia, and millions of men were pulled to the front lines, Americans would not want to go and fight a third war in Europe to save Europe. And I love Europe. I love Europeans. Obviously, I'm of Scottish and German descent, but Americans are not going to want to sign up to save Europe or to fight another war on European soil again after doing it twice within the span of 100 years. It's not going to happen a third time. It's never going to happen. There's no way you're going to admit or convince Americans that they are in danger enough to go and sign up to fight this conflict. And even with Taiwan, same thing. You're not going to get Americans signing up to fight China unless Chinese paratroopers are landing in Hawaii or California. It's never going to happen. And I don't think the Chinese are ever going to be bold enough to do something like that. Their interest is Taiwan and the South China Sea and Southeast Asia. It's not in the North American continent, at least not having like a physical military presence here. So if Mark Levin and Ben Shapiro aren't willing to come to terms with the American psyche, insofar as intervening in foreign wars, then they're wasting their time. And no amount of gaslighting or shaming people within the Republican Party is actually going to change the way that things are moving. Is that not great for Israel? I guess not. If you're an Israeli nationalist and you lose the support of the United States and you no longer have the United States military in your back pocket as an insurance policy. But the thing is, Americans aren't Israelis, and most American Christians aren't dispensationalists either. I mean, that's a thing with evangelicals, but as far as like Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox and like mainline Protestants, it's just not a thing. So you're not going to convince Americans using religious reasons either that they should sign up for this or send more weapons or funding or even send more troops for some kind of intervention. It's not going to happen. And I think as that continues to fester in the Republican Party, this gulf is just going to get wider. You can't reconcile the two. You can't reconcile having a foreign lobby pushing American foreign policy in a particular direction and having a large segment of that same party saying, no, we've had enough. No more foreign wars, no more interventions. Period. We don't need it. We know we're in a strong strategic position. We know we are essentially an unassailable fortress. We know that China and Russia have no great designs to invade our fortress. They can't do it even if they try. They don't have the logistical ability. And frankly, we don't have the logistical ability to do it either. If anyone thinks the United States could pull enough men together to fight a ground war in Eastern Europe against the Russians, or a war in the South China Sea or Southeast Asia against the Chinese at this point, they're out of their minds. We can't do it. We can't pull it off. And we know we can't pull it off. No country right now has the ability to pull off military operations of that size unless they went to a total war economy, and no one's going to do it. So that's my opinion on the matter. So you just can't reconcile these two positions. There's no solving it. And just to say one more time, no amount of hall monitoring in the Republican Party is going to fix this because they don't understand why it's happening. They can blame people like Fuentes. They can blame people like Tucker, like this feeling just magically came out of ether and they just convinced people over the last 6 months to feel the way they feel about foreign interventions. No, they're a symptom of it. They're not the cause of it. They wouldn't exist if people didn't already feel this way. But anyways, I'm going to move on to the next topic. And last independent thinker. Glad you're doing good. Hope you had a great Christmas, by the way. Thanks for being here. Just out of curiosity, what's your opinion on what I just mentioned? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Let's hear it. What else I'd like to talk about too, I just mentioned it, foreign intervention. And I just think I did a pretty good job explaining over the last few minutes why foreign intervention is not really something that most Americans are up for. We're interested in defending our own backyard. I think you could probably get Americans on board to over some kind of direct conflict with the Mexican drug cartels. I don't think they'd be quite interested in a direct war with Venezuela, because I think most Americans see that as kind of pointless. This specter of Venezuela is not really prominent in the American psyche as something that we need to fight. I think Americans are much more. Well, okay, yeah, I understand that. You're within the vicinity of China. I think, like, I don't write China off completely as some kind of threat, especially to its neighbors. So, I mean, they're a great power, and great powers behave the way that great powers do. I think the United States we should know that as Americans. Look at what the United States does. I think Chinese companies and American businessmen are too intertwined. I think you have far too many American businessmen that serve Chinese interests over American interests because they're interested in making money. China wants to make money, but I don't think that. Again, I don't advocate for any kind of extremely antagonistic relationship with the Chinese, but at the same time, I don't think American businessmen should be doing things that are detrimental to America or their allies just to make money from the Chinese. I don't agree with that. And also, as an Australian, you are pretty close to China. You're pretty close to their sphere of influence. So, it's a bit different for you than I guess it is for us. The feasibility of some kind of conflict between the Australian military and the Chinese military, any kind of direct confrontation, it's probably a bit more likely, I would say, because of that proximity than it is between the United States and China. I think the United States and China have too much to lose in a direct conflict with one another because of the nuclear weapons. And I think that all of the nations that currently possess nuclear weapons have an unspoken pact to never directly go to war with one another because it's too risky and it's too dangerous, which is why other nations want nuclear weapons, because it's an insurance policy. It makes it so that any conflict between you and another power is relegated to proxy conflicts, or maybe like funding an enemy, but not direct conflict itself because it's too risky. And I think that's why so many Americans are kind of, they think that the Europeans are out of their minds when it comes to this conflict with Russia because of how destructive the end result could be if things get out of control, especially if there was some kind of direct conflict between the United States and Russia. I'm sorry, we're not stopping the Orezhnik. They have hypersonic missile technology that we don't have. Sure, we would do a lot of damage, but they would do a lot of damage back, and millions would die for what? Yeah, I forgot you were Australian, by the way. Yeah, my apologies for that. Yeah, and also too, I'm not really necessity with the coronavirus. And there's a lot of he said, she said stuff going back and forth. Well, was it funded in a Chinese lab with American money? Was this actually made in a American lab with Chinese money? I don't think the Americans and the Chinese should be doing joint research on potentially deadly viruses. I'm just going to go out there and say that. I don't think we should be involved in any way, shape, or form. I think America's relationship with China really just needs to boil down to trade. Using cheap Chinese labor to replace American industry hurts Americans severely. I know the Chinese are ruthless when it comes to economics. They want to make money. They want to expand. I don't think they have many scruples on how they do it and who gets hurt by it. And I think American businessmen and American politicians need to understand that. Having some kind of understanding with the Chinese over their sphere of influence or Taiwan is something we should focus on. But I think we need to unlatch the American economy from the Chinese economy as best we can and be as independent from them as possible. And if I have to pay more for consumer goods because of it, then so be it. I don't care. I'd rather pay extra money for toys for my kids than get something made with lead paint in a Chinese factory that makes things for 1/100th of the cost that it gets made in the United States for. Pour myself another drink here. I'm going to go here for another couple minutes, probably about 10 more minutes or so. And then I'm going to hop off for the night, get some things to do, spend a little time with the wife, just kind of hang out and relax a little bit. I'm actually off work for a few days. I don't go back to work until Monday, typically Monday through Friday, daylight, which is nice, but I got a couple extra days off for Christmas. So I'm doing as much lounging around as I can to enjoy them, because I'm a pretty busy person and I don't get a lot of leisure time. Work long days, come home, work on projects, write music, do this. Still don't have a lot of free time to chill. So I'm going to take advantage of that tonight. Last independent thinker, do you have anything you would like to talk about? Feel free to bring something up. Hey, second person. How you doing out there? I'm trying to think what else could be talked about tonight in this last 10 minutes. I've already talked about the two main topics that I would like to touch upon. American politics in general is just maddening. Like I'm just kind of tired of it. I just wish we had competent people that were pragmatic about America's problems and willing to solve them. That's really what I want deep down today. I'm a very socially conservative person, being a Christian, so I can't really vote Democrat because of their social policies. And when it comes to the Republican Party, there's just a lot of things in their platform too that I vehemently disagree with, and I think just exacerbates our problems and makes things worse for the average American worker. So I don't really know what to do half the time. Most of the time when I vote Republican, I do so while holding my nose. And then very seldom do I even find a relatively sane Democrat who doesn't support literal infanticide. And then even when they do exist, they usually end up in the Republican Party anyways because their own party chases them out for not wanting to murder babies. It will take time to turn the budget around after Doge. Your debt clock. Oh, dude, it's insane. Like, we're $40 trillion in debt. $40 trillion the last time I checked. I don't think. Here's the problem with President Trump. President Trump is not a revolutionary. I don't think he is willing, or ever really was willing, to do what is necessary to turn the United States government around. He's doing a lot of things that are inflammatory, sure, but I don't think he's dealing with the scope of the problem in the way that people know that it needed to be dealt with. And Doge made a lot of cuts to wasteful spending, absolutely. But then we turn around and we gave $1 trillion to the Pentagon, expanded our military budget. So I think a lot of people looked at that and said, well, what was the point? Some programs were cut, but then others were given more money. I don't think, and a lot of this has to do with the fact that Trump is not like a sovereign king in the United States. He can't do whatever he wants. You have a whole party constantly, half of his own party, and the whole other half of the American political establishment against him at every turn. They can only accomplish so much. And I think within the United States government, there's a lot of rot, and there's a lot of people that stand to lose a lot of money if certain programs are done away with or cut in the way that they should be, which is why I'm kind of skeptical of Doge being successful. And our entire economic system isn't even based, our financial system isn't based off of gold. Everybody knows that. So to many of these people, the debt doesn't matter. They don't care. Well, we can just keep printing money endlessly. We have the reserve currency in the world, but that's not going to last forever. As far as I know, I think Russia is buying up a lot of gold. China is buying up a lot of gold. I think their currencies, despite what people say about the ruble and they make fun of it, I think the long-term prospects for the stability of the ruble, considering how much gold Russia seems to have now, is probably a bit better than the dollar, especially as more people, and this was a side effect of the sanctions on Russia, countries want an insurance against American sanctions. They will move away from the dollar whenever they can because of that. These countries didn't have to move away from the dollar, but we made them feel unsafe being on the dollar, which is another short-sighted effect or short-sighted mistake we made with these sanctions. People know that the dollar can be used to blackmail them if they step out of line. Why be part of that system if they don't have to? This is why BRICS is a thing. This is why countries are moving off the dollar, so they don't get sanctioned for stepping out of line. It's such a massive screw up, and just no forward thinking when it comes to that kind of stuff. And the sanctions didn't work anyway, so awesome, fantastic. But yeah, as far as that 40 trillion in debt, it's just, I don't know what we're going to do. For example, the military budget. I'll just say this as an American. I know for a fact our stuff is overpriced, produced for a far higher cost than it should be, because Boeing and Raytheon know that they can charge whatever they want, and the American government will pay it. We are not efficient with our military funding whatsoever. When you look at the Chinese military and the Russian military, people can meme on them all they want, but the fact is they're closing the technological gap pretty quickly, and they have closed it in several areas. Russia has technology that we don't have yet. They have the Orezhnik and they have hypersonic missiles. We don't have those. And their military budget is a fraction of ours. The T-90M is good enough to get the job done. It's a decent tank that costs 1/4 of what the Abrams costs. They're sticking with a platform that works, the AK-47 platform, or the AK platform. They stick with it because it works. We are attempting to get rid of the M4 platform or the M16 platform and replace it with this new SIG that everyone has problems with. That already seems to think is a massive mistake, and we're wasting billions of dollars implementing, this new weapon system to replace one that worked perfectly fine. Wasting money for what? The M16, I own an M4, or the civilian version of it, works great. Love it. Wonderful platform. No, nothing wrong with it whatsoever. But we're getting rid of it for no reason. The F-35 is bloated in price. The F-22, which is a much better plane than the F-35, was far more expensive than even that. Our super carriers cost billions of dollars and can be sunk by a handful of hypersonic missiles. I mean, they're good for like an intimidation factor against smaller countries that don't have the means to take them down. But our budget is bloated through the roof, and for what? Our military at this point in history is not as good as it used to be. At the end of the Cold War, I think the United States had the most formidable military on the planet. The military that the United States had when it went into the Gulf War would have beaten any military on the planet easily at that time. But that was at that time, and that was the military inherited from the Cold War, the constant military innovations and the focus on producing large amounts of equipment and making things cheap and making things efficient. And that time is done. I think ironically, America sort of has the same mentality of late war Nazi Germany. It's just make this really expensive equipment that can just lay waste to everything before it, and we don't need a ton of them, and it's going to be so technologically superior that we don't need to worry about how many we can produce. And I think when it comes to drones, that's something I've noticed. I think, and this is when Pete Hegseth became our Secretary of War, there was an issue because I think he had actually asked one of our weapons manufacturers to come up with a cheap drone akin to like the Shaheed, something along those lines. And instead of coming back to them with the drone that would cost as much as like a high-end car, which is how much I think the Garands and the Shaheeds cost, they came back to him with a $40 million monstrosity that just wasn't practical to use in large numbers. And I think a big part of our debt has to do with just this bloated, disgusting bureaucracy that we have. Our military-industrial complex can demand whatever they want, and it gets paid for it because the American government will just print the money for it. $1 trillion for a military budget when our two chief rivals have equipment that's just as good as the United States on a fraction of the budget. Now, is the United States superior in the air to those two countries still? Yeah, sure. But their air defense is top notch. It's top of the line. It's advanced. And their missile technology is more advanced than ours. So there you go. I don't know. As an American, I just feel endless frustration when I look at these things and just the amount of money we waste, millions of dollars down the drain on every program, and it does nothing. Bridges cost far more than they should. Roads cost far more than they should because the money gets pocketed, and everybody knows it. There's a bridge near me that actually is unusable now because it's so old and had too many structural problems. It was a fairly large bridge between Ohio and West Virginia, and it's not going to be replaced for years. And even when construction starts, I know it's going to cost probably 10 times more than it should because that money is going to get pocketed by the companies that decided to build it, and it's going to go to their CEOs and higher-ups. Just the way it is here. And until we can fix this systematic rot within our entire system, I don't see any of this actually changing. So, but yeah, that's my thoughts on Doge and our debt. I don't think a lot of people overseas realize like how corrupt America's sprawling bureaucracy actually is when it comes to people just pocketing money off of ridiculous things. I think I've read a lot about how bad it is or was in the Soviet Union and how bad it was in like 1990s Russia. And I feel like we might not quite be at that level, but we're gonna get there pretty soon. We're not too far off. But yeah, it's hard not to think about these things, and it really is. It's just I just wish things worked. I just wish we had competent leaders. I wish we had people that understood bad policy as consequences and would do their best to avoid those consequences and not institute bad policy, that would take interest in making sure that their children and their children's children are taken care of, and that their civilization is something that can stick around and that they have pride in. But I think U.S. politicians just don't care. They're just nihilistic. They don't believe in anything. They're here for money, to make money. Their notion of what the United States is just some civic thing that I guess can be whatever it wants to be as long as people uphold the Constitution. I don't know. But anyways, I think I'm going to stop the stream here. I'm going to jump off and spend some time with the family. Thanks for stopping by, Last Independent Thinker. I think I'm going to make Friday night live stream a pretty consistent thing around 8 o'clock. Next Friday, I'll actually be out for my parish's men's night. So I won't be on here. I'll probably do a live stream Saturday instead, or maybe Thursday if I get off of work early enough. Take it easy, man, and hope all is well down there in Australia. Just out of curiosity, what are your guys' winters like? How cold does it actually get there? I'm assuming it really doesn't. I mean, does it rain more? Up here, I mean, we go from 90 degrees in the summer, sometimes warmer, and I think in the winter it averages like maybe 30 degrees, a little colder, sometimes all the way down to like negative 10 degrees, usually lows of like 15 or 20 at nights, a little bit of snow here and there, but it's a pretty big temperature swing. But I'm sure down there with you guys is probably not as extreme. Correct me if I'm wrong, though. Oh, okay. Right on. Okay. Yeah, I think when most Americans think of Australia, they just think of just being hot desert. But also, I don't think people realize how big Australia actually is. It's a pretty massive continent and country. It's very sparsely populated, obviously, but it's much larger than I think people think. And I think there's probably a much more diverse array of climates and temperatures there than I think people would assume. But anyways, I'm hopping off here. You have a great night, Last Independent Thinker. Enjoy your day, and see you next time. And also, too, I'm going to post a dedicated video tomorrow, so that'll be up early afternoon. I got to do some grocery shopping in the morning, so once I get home, I'll have that posted. But have a good one, buddy.